You hear the infant crying before you see it. The sound echoes off stone walls, raw and helpless, the kind of cry that should summon a mother's arms. But the hands that reach for the child are not tender. They belong to old men whose eyes have long forgotten mercy. They turn the baby slowly, examining limbs like a blacksmith inspects a blade for flaws. The mother stands 10 feet away, silent, her breasts still heavy with milk she may never give. She was told this moment would come. She was raised to believe it was an honor, but her hands won't stop trembling. One of the elders traces a finger along the infant's spine, checking for curvature. Another listens to the breath, counting the seconds between each inhale. They are not doctors. They are architects of a future that has no room for weakness. And somewhere in that cold inspection, between one heartbeat and the next, a decision is made that will either grant life or deny it entirely. Before we go any further into what happened next, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching this from. It's wild to me that a story this ancient, this buried in time, still reaches people all over the world. Let me know you're here. This is Sparta, around 700 BCE, though the system would endure for centuries. The Greek historian Plutarch, writing long after Sparta's glory had faded, described these practices with a mixture of horror and fascination. He drew from older sources, Spartan oral traditions, fragmented laws attributed to the legendary lawgiver Lycurgus, accounts from travelers who witnessed the rituals firsthand. What he documented wasn't myth, it was policy. A republic built not on philosophy or trade, but on the deliberate engineering of human beings. Because Sparta didn't just train warriors, it bred them. From conception to grave, every stage of life was controlled, measured, and weaponized. The goal wasn't happiness, it wasn't freedom, it was perfection. And perfection, as they understood it, required the elimination of everything soft, everything uncertain, everything human that didn't serve the state. The question isn't whether their methods worked. History already answered that. The question is, what kind of society decides that love is a luxury it cannot afford? It began long before birth, in the cold arithmetic of matchmaking. In most Greek city-states, marriage was a private affair, a negotiation between families seeking alliance or wealth. In Sparta, it was a public assignment. Magistrates examined young men and women the way farmers examine breeding stock, measuring height, bone structure, muscle density, signs of fertility. Beauty didn't matter. Charm was irrelevant. What mattered was whether the pairing could produce a child strong enough to hold a spear for 20 years without breaking. Love was never part of the equation. Desire was tolerated only if it aligned with duty. The state didn't care if a husband and wife despised each other, as long as they reproduced. But here's where it gets darker. If a marriage failed to produce children, or if the children were weak, the state didn't wait. It intervened. A husband whose wife couldn't conceive was encouraged, sometimes ordered, to find another woman, one with a proven record of healthy births, and impregnate her instead. The transaction carried no stigma. It wasn't adultery because the concept of fidelity had been redefined. Loyalty was owed not to a spouse, but to Sparta. The original wife was expected to accept this arrangement without protest, and many did, because they'd been raised in a society that taught them their bodies were not their own. They were instruments of the state, and the state's needs always came first. The women of Sparta were trained for this role from childhood. While girls in Athens were kept indoors, learning to weave and manage households, Spartan girls ran in the open air. They wrestled, threw javelins, lifted stones, not for their own strength, but to prepare their bodies for pregnancy. Plutarch noted that Spartan women were fed better than women elsewhere in Greece, given more physical freedom, more social power, but all of it came with a price. They were being conditioned to believe that their value lay in the vigor of the sons they could produce. A woman who bore strong children was honored. One who bore weak ones, or none at all, lived in quiet shame. and the state made sure every woman understood motherhood was not a choice, it was conscription. When a child was finally born, the mother's ordeal was just beginning. The infant was taken from her within hours and carried to the Gerousia, the Council of Elders. These men, all over 60, held absolute authority over who lived and who didn't. They examined each newborn with ruthless precision. Was the baby's cry strong? Did its limbs move symmetrically? Was the skull properly formed? Any sign of deformity, a clubfoot, a cleft palate, even excessive crying, could be a death sentence. The elders washed the infant in wine, an old test. If the child convulsed, it was deemed too weak. If it remained calm, it passed the first trial. But passing wasn't guaranteed life. It only meant the child was allowed to continue existing under observation. Because even after the initial inspection, Spartan infants lived under constant scrutiny. Mothers were instructed not to coddle them. No rocking to sleep, no immediate response to cries, no softness that might breed dependency. The goal was to harden them from birth, to teach them that comfort was conditional and survival was earned. And if at any point during those early months a child showed signs of weakness, illness, frailty, failure to thrive, it could still be taken away. The ones who failed the inspection were carried to a place called the apothetae, deposits at the foot of Mount Taygetos. It was a chasm, a rocky pit where exposure did what the state refused to call murder. The infants were left there, abandoned to the elements, to starvation, to wild animals. Ancient sources disagree on whether they were thrown directly into the chasm or left on the slopes to die more slowly. Archaeologists have found bones there, small, fragile, heartbreaking, but not enough to confirm the full scale. Some historians argue the practice was exaggerated by Sparta's enemies. Others point to the sheer consistency of the accounts across centuries. Plutarch didn't flinch when he described it. Neither did Aristotle. For them, it was simply what Sparta did. The logic was brutal but coherent. Sparta was a tiny city-state surrounded by enemies and built on the backs of the helots, enslaved peoples who outnumbered Spartan citizens by as much as 7 to 1. Every generation had to be strong enough to suppress revolt and repel invasion. A single weak cohort could mean the collapse of everything. So the Spartans made a choice: sacrifice the few to preserve the many. Pity was treason. Compassion was suicide. They convinced themselves that leaving a deformed infant to die wasn't cruelty. It was mercy. Mercy to the city that couldn't afford to feed and protect the weak. Mercy to the child who would have suffered a life of inadequacy. They built an entire philosophy around it, and they taught their mothers to believe it too. And the mothers, gods, the mothers, learned not to cry. They learned to stand silent as their infants were carried away to swallow grief like poison, to tell themselves it was honor. Because to mourn was to question the state, and to question the state was to become an enemy of Sparta. So they buried their pain in the same earth that claimed their children, and they tried again. They conceived again, carried again, birthed again, hoping this time the child would be strong enough to survive. It was a lottery of flesh and bone, and every woman played whether she wanted to or not. For the children who survived, the nightmare was only beginning. At age 7, boys were taken from their mothers and enrolled in the agoge, Sparta's state-run training program. It wasn't school, it was systematic brutalization disguised as education. The boys were divided into groups and assigned to barracks where they would live for the next 13 years. Their beds were thin reeds they had to gather themselves from the riverbank. Their clothing was a single cloak, worn year-round regardless of weather. Their food was deliberately insufficient. Hunger, the instructors explained, sharpens the senses and teaches resourcefulness. If a boy wanted more to eat, he had to steal it. And if he was caught, he was beaten. Not for stealing, but for being clumsy enough to get caught. This wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was pedagogy. The agoge was designed to strip away everything that made a child soft: comfort, security, individuality, and rebuild him as a weapon. Every lesson had a purpose. The inadequate food taught self-reliance. The brutal discipline taught obedience. The public beatings taught that pain was inevitable and screaming was disgrace. They learned to speak in short, sharp sentences, wasting no words. This economy of language gave birth to the term laconic, derived from Laconia, the region around Sparta. A boy who rambled was beaten. A boy who hesitated was humiliated. Speed, precision, and silence became survival skills. The older boys ruled over the younger with cruelty that was sanctioned, even encouraged. They asked questions like traps. Who is the bravest Spartan? What is worth more, victory or life? Can theft be noble? The answers mattered less than the delivery. A boy who stuttered or showed fear was beaten on the spot. It was a hierarchy of pain, each level inflicted by the one above it, and the whole system overseen by adult trainers who watched with approval. Because the goal wasn't just to create soldiers, it was to create men who had internalized control so deeply that they policed themselves. Once a year, this control was tested in a ritual that horrified even other Greeks. At the altar of Artemis Orthia, boys were required to steal cheese placed on the sacred stone while older youths and priests whipped them. The goal wasn't to take the cheese. It was to endure the lash without crying out. Boys who screamed were shamed. Boys who collapsed silently were celebrated. Some, according to ancient accounts, died under the whip without making a sound, blood pooling at their feet while they smiled. Tourists from across Greece came to watch, marveling at the spectacle like it was theater. And in a sense, it was. It was Sparta performing its identity, proving to the world and to itself that its people were not like other people. They were harder, colder, better. But the darkest part of the agoge wasn't public. It was the crypteia, a secret rite of passage that turned young men into killers. Each year, the Spartan state formally declared war on the Helots. This wasn't metaphor, it was legal cover for murder. The best young warriors were selected and sent into the countryside with a knife and orders to kill any helot who seemed too strong, too intelligent, too proud. They were to move at night, hide by day, and return only when they'd proven they could take a life without hesitation. It wasn't about reducing the helot population, it was about testing the boys. Could they kill in cold blood? Could they do it not out of rage or fear, but out of duty? Those who returned weren't celebrated. They were simply accepted, as if crossing an invisible threshold from human to Spartan. At 30, a man was finally allowed to live with a wife. But even this was stripped of intimacy. The wedding was a performance of dominance. The bride's head was shaved, she was dressed in men's clothing, and left alone in a dark room. The groom, still living in the barracks, would sneak away briefly, consummate the marriage, and return before dawn. This continued for years. Some men fathered children without ever seeing their wives in daylight. The secrecy wasn't romantic. It was strategic. The state feared that attachment to a woman might weaken a soldier's loyalty to his unit. So even marriage, the most intimate human bond, was rationed and controlled. And through it all, the women endured. They had been trained to see their suffering as service. When their sons were taken at 7, they didn't beg or weep. They told them to come back with their shields or on them, victorious or dead. That phrase wasn't poetry. It was instruction. The shield was heavy. A soldier who fled dropped it to run faster. A soldier who died in battle was carried home on it. There was no middle ground, no room for survival without honor. The mothers who spoke those words had buried their tears so deep they'd forgotten how to cry. The state had done its work. It had turned love into obedience, and obedience into instinct. For a while, it worked. Sparta became the most feared military power in Greece. At Thermopylae in 480 BCE, 300 Spartans held off a Persian army of tens of thousands, dying to the last man rather than retreat. Their sacrifice became legend. But legends are easier to build than populations. because while Sparta was producing the perfect warrior, it was also consuming itself. Every battle thinned their ranks. Every ritual of the agoge broke boys who might have become fathers. The eugenics system that rejected weak infants also meant fewer births overall. And slowly, almost invisibly, the number of Spartan citizens began to shrink. By the time of the Peloponnesian War in the late 5th century BCE, the cracks were undeniable. Sparta defeated Athens, achieving total supremacy over Greece. But victory demanded something they'd never learned: governance. Sparta could conquer, but it couldn't build. Its soldiers had been trained for war, not diplomacy, not trade, not administration. Gold flowed into the city from defeated enemies, and with it came corruption. The laws of Lycurgus, which had banned private wealth to preserve equality, were quietly abandoned. Land accumulated in fewer hands. The warrior elite who had once shared a single cloak now dined on imported luxuries. The system that had made them strong was rotting from within. And then came Leuctra. In 371 BCE, a Theban general named Epaminondas did something unthinkable. He broke the rules. Spartan armies fought in rigid, symmetrical lines, believing order was invincible. Epaminondas concentrated his best troops on one side, 50 men deep, and smashed directly into the Spartan right flank where King Cleombrotus stood. It was innovation against tradition, imagination against discipline. And when the dust settled, the king was dead. The myth of Spartan invincibility died with him. Sparta never recovered. Its population continued to collapse. Fewer than 1,000 full citizens remained by the time Rome rose to power. Spartan mothers still told their sons to come back with their shields, but there were fewer sons to send. The rituals continued, the whippings at the altar, the harsh training, but they'd become theater. Roman tourists visited to watch, the way people visit museums. Sparta had become a ghost, haunting its own ruins. What remains today isn't stone or empire. It's a warning written in the bones of infants left on a mountainside. Sparta believed it had discovered the formula for perfection: control everything, eliminate weakness, sacrifice the individual for the collective. And for a time, it worked. They created warriors who didn't fear death, but they also created a society that couldn't sustain life. The same system that taught mothers to give up their sons ensured that eventually there would be no sons left to give. The perfection they chased was a horizon that receded with every step until they walked off the edge of the world. Perhaps that's why the story still haunts us, because we recognize the impulse, the desire to optimize, to engineer, to eliminate the flaws that make us messy and mortal. Every civilization carries that temptation like a seed, the dream of perfect order, perfect strength, perfect control. Sparta simply had the audacity to try. They took that impulse to its logical extreme and discovered that perfection is just another word for extinction. From childhood, every Spartan was stripped of weakness. The state became both parent and god, deciding who was fit to live and who was not. Infants were inspected for defects and cast aside if they failed to meet the standard. Boys were torn from their mothers at 7 and trained to kill by 12. Pain was not an obstacle. It was instruction. Emotion was a liability. Compassion, a kind of treason. In their relentless pursuit of purity, they carved away everything that made them human until all that remained was discipline, obedience, and the will to endure. And for a time, it worked. They built the strongest warriors the ancient world had ever seen. Their enemies feared their silence, their unity, their absolute refusal to break. Yet, beneath the bronze and blood, something vital had begun to die. A society cannot live forever on discipline alone. Warriors need something worth protecting: love, art, laughter, the simple chaos of human life. Sparta forgot that. When their borders finally faltered, there were no poets left to sing their glory, no families strong enough to rebuild. They had trained their sons to die well, but not to live well. and by the time they remembered what they'd sacrificed, it was too late. There was nothing left but the echo of their own discipline, ringing hollow through empty barracks where even perfection had grown cold. In the end, Sparta's greatest creation wasn't its soldiers. It was the silence they left behind. The silence of mothers who learned not to cry, of children who learned not to scream, of a civilization that forgot how to be human. And that silence, more than any battle or law, is what history remembers. Not the glory, the absence where love should have been.